I was born in 1931 to Simon Gwina and Rosa Gwina. My mother was a Cele by birth. My father came from the Cape, and they met here in KwaZulu-Natal near Adams College, where my father was working. Born of an orphan, he was an orphan himself, and when he met my mother, they thought the best way to go in approaching parents was to go my mother's way. So they went off to Umzimkhulu, where my grandfather had settled. I don't know how far you want to go back, but my grandfather was from Indwedwe by birth, but he had moved on in his adventures down to Cape Town, where he went to school. I'm talking of the 1860s, 1850s. He went to school in Cape Town and was working as well, supporting himself. He was a young man, I think somewhere about 18 or so at the time, and he decided after a while to further his studies. And somebody, a woman who worked with him, decided that it was best for him to go to Lovedale. That's where he would get the kind of education he was looking for. And so my grandfather, moved on to Lovedale, and that's where he worked as a groomsman. Don't know all the details, but as a groomsman. And he also worked for Dr. Stewart, who at the time was among the earliest people who worked around Fort Hare. So he was working there for some years. Then finally he decided to come home and to Ndwedwe, and he found it was at the time of the 1980s, by 1990s, beginning of the 1990s, when there was all those problems about land and about who lived where, and he decided to go and live at Umzimkhulu. So my roots are at Umzimkhulu because of that. And my grandfather decided he wanted his children educated. And he said, I don't care if it's a boy or a girl, whoever wants education, I'll give it to them. And my mother was one of the ones who chose to go for education, and she went to learn at Inanda Seminary. At Inanda. My grandmother had been to Inanda Seminary herself, the earliest girls at Inanda. And so when they met there, apparently they were. Easy for me to point you at the pictures. They got married soon in the late 90s, 1890s. And that's my background in terms of interest, who did what and why. So my mother was from Inanda. She went to study at Edendale for teacher training. And a lot of my life, therefore, was mixed up with these experiences. Education was fundamental in my grandfather's family, and it became fundamental in my own family when my mother met another teacher. She was already a teacher herself. And I can say my interest in reading and in education came from that. My parents, we were in the rural areas. They didn't have a big cupboard of books, but they had boxes of books. And that's where my sister and I, we were the first two, took our interest. We realized that whenever our parents were talking and they didn't want us to hear what they were saying, they would speak in English. And we began to see the connection between the box and the language they were using in the house. And we got interested ourselves. We began to read. We began to take a lot of interest in what was the written word and what secrets it could hold. Again, the background to this feeling was me having recently arrived from many years of travel as an exile. And I didn't think people knew me. I knew then that people in this country didn't know my name. After all, my books were banned in before then. And so I didn't expect people to know much about me. And I was just a new arrival in South Africa, so to speak. Yes. And I was very surprised. I really was surprised that I could be recognized in that sense. I didn't even find South Africans being interested, at least most of the South Africans I met at the time, being interested in reading and writing and writers. My son got the news from a friend first, and he teased me about it. And so when I first heard, I was surprised, but I didn't think it was real. That was the first reaction. I didn't feel it was something that they really meant it. And it was only a day or so later when I got the news that I was nominated by the City Council of Durban to be recognized. I didn't understand, how they could have thought I was a good writer, especially because even my books were not really available here. Anyway, I was very, very happy. My parents were both teachers. They were Zulus like every other Zulu. Even my father was no longer Xhosa speaking, so to say. And that was my background. My grandparents, my uncles, my cousins, we were all Zulu speaking. But I noted the problem when we were all together in the family and the conversation would be going on, and suddenly my parents would switch on to English. And I said, what's going on here? And of course, even their songs, a lot of the popular songs were mainly English. There were quite a lot of Zulu ones, but they quite often sang together in English. And this background and the reading word caught me very early. And again, it was through them, my parents, who would be reading books, who would be talking, the books were available. And whenever we wanted to enjoy ourselves, we would get the magazines from their box and look at them. And this was the background that by the age of 8, when I went to school, I was very interested in the written word. And that, not that it was a home, as all Zulus, we lived together more or less as relatives and so on. It was not a familiar language in terms of the whole circle of relatives, but I cottoned on to the written word, and I started practicing writing first of all, just writing in Zulu. Of course, I wasn't writing in English at that stage, but as soon as I got on to school and began to write, I did a lot of writing, little bits. When I say writing, I mean scraps. I don't mean writing stories or anything like that. That came on a little later, round about the age of, well, my father died very soon after. In fact, he died at that very age of about 8. So I got to understand the interest and the importance of writing. The stories that my mother told us, my family again was very fond of telling stories. I learned a lot from that, before I recognized the big connection between the written word and English. My mother was a fantastic storyteller, and she too had got it from her own grandmother. My grandmother is the source of interest in the literary sense, even though my great-grandmother wasn't a writer. I mean, there was no script. But a story is a story. It doesn't matter what language it comes through to you. So my great-grandmother had influenced my own mother and my uncles in the storytelling tradition. And I soon made the connection. Once in a while, my mother would tell us, because she had gone to Edendale, and the principal of Edendale was a dent. You know, there were 3 dents in education in South Africa at the time, and one of them was head of education in KwaZulu-Natal. And later, funny enough, the other dent brother was to become my professor at Fort Hare. So the dents had this interest in not only teaching, but in bringing us into the other world, the written word. For instance, my professor taught my mother a lot of, not the professor, the brother, taught my mother, would tell them stories of the Greek mythology. And when my mother was tired of telling all these stories, repeating night after night, once in a while she would tell us the stories of the Greek mythology. And at the time it didn't make sense to me that we were crossing borders here. But it was to dawn on me much later. For instance, when I went overseas and found myself in Greece, and really I was standing right there at the temple of Poseidon. Never mind, let me stop. I'm beginning to wonder. Well, having said a lot about English and my parents, yes, I also came from a very traditional background. My parents were very traditional, particularly my grandparents. And some of the background to teaching is to do with just that storytelling. And when they told us a lot of stories, I became aware that there's a fountain of knowledge that comes through reading and storytelling. My literary background, if I was to speak widely, was from the traditional stories that our parents taught us, and values. And I think what is lacking today is one of those aspects. Mm. Our children today don't get, parents are too busy. And when the culture broke at the turn of the century, and families broke up, and fathers went into the cities, this tradition of rearing, of sharpening the mind, there is a lot of value in storytelling and the acquisition of that knowledge. Be it in any language, it is very deep and valuable. As I later learned in England and saw the children I was teaching, if a child wasn't making much move in writing or things like that, I concentrated on the story side of things and found that they soon sharpened. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of our minds are related to storytelling. Mm. And one of the things we have lost, and I don't think people are as much aware of that as they should be, is the ability to learn through storytelling. Many parents are too busy doing this and that. They come home, they're tired, they're telling children off, they're putting them to sleep, and they leave a very big gap of knowledge by not relating through storytelling to the children. And so I think That's one of the areas that is not even emphasized in our talk today about education, about the problems that we're facing educationally. Our children are missing, there's a link lost between relating through storytelling, relating through values, understanding our world through stories, and that's one area that I think is very unfortunately overlooked. And of course, I know that the education was terribly fractured by the policies that were later adopted by the nationalist government. They lost not only their own culture, they lost the culture of reading, the culture of storytelling, the culture of writing. You can't write when you can't read. And so those are some of the gaps that need to be filled up in our education if we're going to go anywhere. And we quite often ask children to take a leap into the other world of, you must write, you must write. A child writes what they know. And if we are unable to help them with knowing the world they live in, they're not going to write. They're going to skip and jump this bit of knowledge, and so on. Those, I'm talking now as a teacher myself, and as a person who knows where the gaps are. And I'm very passionate about something that is lacking in South Africa. The reading, the art of reading is one great mistake that we have lost, that our children have lost. Many of our children don't know the value. Why should we write? I mean, even if you can't penetrate the mind of a child, if you insist on this, you must do this, we must do this, you must get on with this, somewhere at the back of the child's mind. But why? What for? Therefore, in approaching our children, the education is not just lost in the classroom. In my view, it is lost at home, it is lost in the cultural environment, and that's where the mistakes are. And then, of course, they then lose education. And, of course, to make it worse, they often don't even learn in a language they know. So all of it becomes a useless effort in terms of the child's mind. I don't have a lot of relationships here. As I said, if I have any relationships, they're mostly in Johannesburg. But when I began to write seriously, when I got to England, I began to mix with other writers. I was very fortunate to keep company with people who, I will say, mentored me in terms of serious writing. Whereas, as a young student at Fort Hare, I was almost discouraged in the art of writing because, our culture can destroy children without realizing it. The professors and lecturers were very interested in men. Now, at the time when I went to Fort Hare, there were only 38 girls at Fort Hare, and there were 400 men. And when I say 38, I mean from the whole country, and Zimbabwe, and Kenya, and all the African states that are neighboring states. And so, at that point, the professors seemed a lot more interested in male students. No matter how much effort you put into what you thought was right, I realized that they really were they were teaching men, and then there was a mistake or some unfortunate situation where there were women as well. Some of them even had an aggressive attitude when they asked you a question. And so this prepared me for a situation where I was discouraged from writing. I didn't think anybody really would be interested in hearing what I had to say. But when I got to London, I met a group of women. We used to meet once or twice a week. And I knew that not only were other people interested in my writing, but that in fact I was benefiting so much. I owe a lot to the young women, mainly white women, whom I mixed with in London. And that's when I enjoyed the company of other writers. And by the time I met Miriam Tladi, I was very happy to find a South African woman writer. She came and we mixed a lot with others. And of course, by the time we were at that point, in fact, it was at the time when there was the feminist movement. It was very strong. And so I collided with these forces with great joy. I enjoyed it. And I still enjoy it when it's available. I do mix with some of the writers, some of the professors from the university. Professor Damon, she actually lives in the same block, and others who are interested in writing, who have mentored my, it sort of expanded my outlook and my interest in writing, but very few South African, particularly women in KwaZulu-Natal. Well, that question is really not for me to answer. I cannot answer about what my future or what people will think or my past. Whatever, a legacy is something that you don't create. You live your life as best you can. And other people pick you up quite often after you're gone, and you become a feature of their own lives, of their own interest. And so I cannot answer that question honestly. I don't know. In fact, that's why I was so surprised when I was chosen by my own city to this position where we are today.
Yes.
Because first of all, I didn't realize that there were people who were really interested in me. Writing had become a private enterprise, something that I did for myself and shared with a few friends who were like-minded. I didn't realize that there would be people in KwaZulu-Natal, in my city, who would be interested enough. I have connected with the what's that association of, where is that place? But it's here in Durban, where we meet. I get invited to these meetings sometimes, not writers' meetings, just activities in Durban.
Yes.
And perhaps through that, I have formed links, and some of them, of course, have heard of my writing, and my book, And They Didn't Die, has done a lot for me, particularly here well, actually not just in Durban. But if anybody knows about me, they would only know about that book. All the others, they don't know about them. My personal achievements. As I say, it is difficult for me to recognize my own achievement. And I don't know if I'm coming through correctly. I just live in this little room. I write in this little room. And except for these exceptional occasions, yes, I'm not aware that other people or my world know much about me or take an interest in me. If I've had any problems at all, I've had problems with other writers, other South African writers in England, where you would find that if your ideas about life, about politics, don't particularly synchronize, shall I say, then they take a stand against you. I've gone through a very painful times when my fellow writers would fight me for this or that, or my opinions, or whatever. But otherwise, writing for me is very private, and I don't know when people recognize it. It's only now that I'm beginning to see that my output is not in vain. People are interested in what I'm doing, and they're interested in my ideas, and they accept, they validate me. And it's something new. It's something that I've not new in this country. Overseas, there are very few countries I didn't go to. I visited United States conferences several times, and Italy was one of those that I visited very often. There were many countries, in the Scandinavian countries I went to, I was well recognized overseas. But even then, inside of me, I kept wondering, when will I ever discuss or get in touch or contact my own people? What a pity, it's all away from home. So that was one of my biggest regrets for years and years. And when I came home, I didn't find what I was looking for initially. It's only lately, and these are some of the highlights of that recognition, and nothing could please me more than being recognized by my own people in South Africa.